Hello lovely people, welcome to another episode of Book Chat, my weekly roundup of things I've read at some point in the past.
Sophie vlogs.
Not to sound like a broken record, but I have another cold. This is number 7. I'm sorry if I'm a bit stuffy bumbly, we're just going to dive in. The book I'm going to start with, I've given back to the library, but I'm going to kick things off with Once and Future by Amy Rose Capetta, and I cannot remember the second person's name. I'm blanking. I'm very sorry. It will be in the description down below. I've had to give the book back to the library, so I don't have it with me. This is a YA gender-bent sci-fi retelling of King Arthur. I really like the myth of King Arthur. I really like reading reinterpretations of it. It's something that I really like doing. So if you have any recommendations of reinterpretations of it, I would very much be interested to hear them. I went into this with, I wouldn't say low expectations, but if you were to say to me, queer gender-bent sci-fi retelling of King Arthur, my expectations are very high and my excitement is very high. I did watch Jade at Jaded Reader did a reading vlog of her experience reading it, and she is also very into King Arthur, so I was inclined to trust her thoughts on it. And she did say it was a bit disappointing. So I went in, I was like, I won't buy it, I'll get it out of my library, I'll see how I feel about it. But I was like, if I go in with lower expectations, then I can enjoy it for what it is, rather than going in and being like, this concept sounds amazing, I expect high things. And I am glad I did that. There were things I liked about this book, there were some things which I didn't love about this book. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because to me a 3 out of 5 stars is a perfectly decent book. The basic setup of this is that we are in a future whereby everyone, Earth is sort of died, people live on different planets, there's this big global corporation, like, I don't know what the word is if it's like throughout space, intergalactic, that's the one, intergalactic organization that are very controlling and that sort of thing. And essentially Merlin wakes up. This has the common trope of Merlin aging backwards. So by now he's a teenager because he's been locked in this battle with Morgana where generation after generation he falls asleep for a bit, he wakes up, it's a new Arthur, he has to go through the cycle again and try and break this cycle and try and win and stop Arthur from dying and all these things. So by this stage Merlin's aged back to a teenager. Merlin? What did I say about the cold? And then he meets up with Ari, and then the general Arthurian shenanigans ensue. Things that I liked about this. I loved how normalised queerness is in this world. I think it is one of the massive pluses. You have characters who are asexual, you have characters who are non-binary. There is the Arthur-Guinevere romance in this is a female-female romance. Stuff like this, and it's a world in which it's very normalised for that to be the case. So, you know, asking someone's pronouns is a normal thing to do, stuff like that. And I just loved how much that was just part of the world. That was really lovely. And also, some of the characters in this I did really like. I think if we jump off of that onto one of my critiques of this is some of the characterization is less strong than others. So, for example, like Lamorak is non-binary, and from their introduction, they seemed very cool, and I was very excited when they were introduced because I was like, oh, this is exciting. I like how this character's been interpreted. But we never really moved beyond that point. We didn't really get much development there. That's just one example of that. I felt like that kind of happened with a number of characters. I think the sort of core characters, so like Ari, Kay, Merlin, and Guinevere are the most fleshed out that you have. A lot of the other side characters did just feel like they're introduced and you're like, here are 3 things about them, and then you get no more. And I would have liked if they were a bit more fleshed out. Back onto a positive, I enjoyed seeing how this plot developed. We swiftly became aware that, like, as well as this tussle between Merlin and Morgana, there's also a greater conflict that will ensue with this intergalactic organization, and, you know, that sort of, I enjoyed that developing. Another critique I would have is that also sometimes the pacing wasn't great, so I really enjoyed this overarching, okay, we've got this reoccurring conflict that's been happening for ages that is bubbling, but we also have this conflict with the intergalactic organization. I felt like sometimes the pacing of the plot was to the detriment of these things. So I enjoyed this conflict. There were moments which we went from a long build-up to something and then something being over very quickly. And that happened a couple of times. It happened both with plot elements, but also with relationships. So there was stuff to do with certain romantic relationships in this, which we very quickly went from like a place, and then suddenly we're in this place, and then we're in this place. I don't know. I just, some things were given more time than I felt like they should have been given, and some things were given not enough time. That said, this is the first book in a series. I would be interested to see where this series is going to go next. I probably wouldn't buy the sequel. I would probably get it out of my library again. But on the whole, I did enjoy it. It has kind of left me craving a really good Arthuriana interpretation. It's made me want to check something else out, and I don't know what that thing is because I don't have it. I don't have the answer. But mixed feelings. Second up is a graphic novel. This is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Volume 1, High School is Hell. This is a reimagining, that's the word of the day. This is a reimagining of first season of Buffy, but if it was set in contemporary times. So how would these characters be different? So this is packed full of the characters that you will know and love if you've watched Buffy, but it's sort of looking at, okay, these are sort of the tropes that they were in the time it was originally made. If this was made now, what would those tropes look like? So for example, like Cordelia as the popular girl is no longer like too cool for you, mean kind of girl. She's instead like, she's really nice to everyone, and she does like really good activism stuff and blah blah blah. Like that's the popular girl now. So that was interesting to see how all these different characters are interpreted. So like Willow is already out when you start this. Some of these decisions felt really well done. So I think there's a whole thing with Xander and how Xander's experiencing maybe not always feeling part of the group, which is stuff which I think he did experience in the early seasons of Buffy. It's just like, how would that be interpreted if he had access to like smartphones and technology and the internet and stuff like that? So I think that's really interesting. I'm sort of intrigued. We've sort of this is the introductory volume, so there are plot developments to happen. We've been given a lot of seeds, and they are starting to come together. We've been left on a little bit of a cliffhanger. I'm certainly interested to see where this cliffhanger is going next. Essentially, this has interested me. It has tantalized me. I'm not 100% like, oh my god, I need you to give me the second volume immediately, but like, I would read the second volume because I have things that I need answers to, and I'm enjoying it. And the art style is really gorgeous. I think the art does a really good job of resembling the actors really well, whilst also putting their own spin on it with like the types of fashion they're wearing and stuff like that. Because sometimes with the Buffy comics, there have been some artists I have preferred much more than other artists. And sometimes they try and make them look hyper like the actors, and other times they just make them look completely different. I think, especially because this is sort of rebooting it, and it's tapping into a lot of nostalgia whilst also doing a lot of like contemporary stuff, I think it's quite a good idea to have them look quite similar to the actors, because it means that when you're meeting these people, because they are styled differently and stuff like that, you still know who they are, which is quite key to me, because sometimes I'm like, I don't know who you are, I don't know your face, and then it turns out they're like Anya, and you're like, oh, I didn't know that. Changing tack completely, as I am often wont to do, we have A Traveller in Time by Alison Uttley. This is a very iconic, to me, piece of middle grade historical fiction. The reason I picked this up in the first place is because my lovely friend who's been doing a master's in children's literature has graduated, and her novel is all about, it's a time slip novel, it's all about Tudor times and that sort of thing, and we were talking about books that we could like, if you were to try and explain to someone what her novel is like, what comparisons would you draw? And personally, I draw a comparison with this book. This is about Penelope, who lives in the 20th century. She's a little bit ill, so she goes to stay with her family in the countryside. They're living in this farmhouse called Thacker's, and what happens is she starts glimpsing people from hundreds of years ago, and eventually she's able to slip between times. what this is really focusing on is it's focusing on the Babington plot, which, this isn't a spoiler because very early on you know how the Babington plot ends, and that's part of what this novel does. But the Babington plot was a plot that when Mary Queen of Scots, who was came to England, fled to England after being defeated in battle in Scotland, and then Elizabeth like locked her up in a bunch of places. The Babington plot was a plot to help her escape, to put her on the throne, to overthrow Elizabeth I. It ended badly. Anthony Babington, for whom it is named after, died very nastily, and essentially Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded, and that is history. One of the things that works so well about this book to me is that you're given that information very early on. So Penelope keeps slipping back in time. She's meeting the Babington family. She meets Anthony Babington. She mainly connects to Francis, his younger brother. I don't know if Francis was real or not, or if he's a plot point. That was kind of hard to tell from Wikipedia. But she is, even as she knows in her modern head that history didn't play out in a way that is going to be good to this family, she still can't help but connect to this family and grow to love this family and root for them to succeed and be involved in their plots. And that is part of what makes this, I feel like this is a novel that kind of makes you ache. It's a bit bittersweet. It gives you a heartache because you know that this is never going to end in a way that is going to be good for these characters, but you still grow to love these characters just like Penelope does. And she feels torn, and it's very interesting how when she's back in time, she's in danger of forgetting her contemporary time. So sometimes she's very aware, and so they're discussing these things, and she knows that that's not what happens, and blah, blah, blah. And other times, it's like she's starting to lose herself in that past time, and she has like a sense of dread, and she can't remember why she has a sense of dread, but she knows that there's something. So this navigating of what happens if you spend too long in the time slip. Maybe you would stay there. Does she want to choose to stay there? Does she want to be with her family? That sort of thing. I just think it's done really well, and I think it's done at a really great age-appropriate level. I also think the world building is really great. So, like when she's in Elizabethan times, there are a lot of details which help you know that before she might necessarily have run into any of the people that you would recognise. It's like, oh, it now smells like this. Oh, this thing which used to be on the wall is not there anymore. And really it's showing you what the difference between that 20th century house is and that Elizabethan house is. And, you know, what are things that are the same? What are things that have lasted that stretch of time? What are things that are different? How is an Elizabethan house different to, like, this contemporary house? Or rather, contemporary, like, 20th century, not now. But yes, I just think this is a classic. This was a reread for me, but I haven't reread it in many years. I had an absolutely lovely time. I had forgotten how much I loved this book. So yes, it was lovely. And if anyone would like a time slip novel for a 7 to 12-year-old, this is cracking. Finally, I'm going to end on some non-fiction. This is Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the House of Caesar by Tom Holland. This follows the House of Caesar. So, Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. I'm going to be 100% honest. I skim-read / skipped through Julius to Augustus only because I studied that at university, so I am very familiar with, and I'm more familiar than I thought I was before I started reading this. But I started reading this and I was like, I do know all these things. So I will say that I did kind of skim through that bit a bit. But from Tiberius onwards, I read the whole thing because that was the stuff I didn't really know. I think Tom Holland did a really great job on this. I think this was just, for me, this was a really great way to get a better understanding of the rounded picture of some of these people's time as Caesar. I know, because I like history, I knew facts about all of these guys, but I didn't have a clear sense in my mind of like, okay, well, how did blah blah actually, how did we go from Tiberius to Caligula? I knew how we went from Claudius to Nero, but I was like, how do you go from Augustus to Tiberius to Caligula to Claudius? Like, what are the machinations that are happening? Who are the other people who were relevant? Not just the Caesars, but who are the other political movers that were involved in these things that have an effect on these things? All of this stuff, I think this is really great if you would like I found this quite an accessible read myself. that covers more than just, like, we're not just talking about the Caesars, we're talking about the whole political situation as a whole, but then we do also go into, he fleshes things out a bit more. He's like, okay, well, let me tell you some stuff about Roman religion that's going to help tie into this thing. Let me tell you about, like, Ovid and how that related to this reign and that sort of thing. So, I had a thoroughly good time. Yeah, I enjoyed this. It was really good. Thank you, Dad. Buying it for me. That's everything I wanted to talk about in this book. This book chat. I'm sorry, I'm so full of cold. That's everything I wanted to talk about in this book chat. As per usual, have you read any of these? I would love to hear from you if you have. I would very much love to hear from you if you have recommendations for Arthuriana retellings, and also good time slip, maybe like historical time slip things. That would be quite fun, because Traveller in Time gave me some interesting thoughts. But yes, otherwise, that's everything I have to talk about this week, and I will see you next time for something different.